The rain was coming down hard that evening, the kind of relentless downpour that seemed determined to wash everything clean: streets, sidewalks, and maybe even the layers of prejudice that had built up in her heart over the years. Emily Grant, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for hard-hitting and often controversial opinions, sat alone in her car. The wipers slapped back and forth in a frantic rhythm as she stared at the rundown community center in front of her. She didn't want to be here. Not tonight. Not ever. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Emily wasn't just any journalist. She was one of those journalists, the kind whose words could spark debates and stir outrage, especially among those she wrote about. For years, her columns had taken aim at marginalized communities, thinly veiled in what she liked to call hard truths. To her readers, she was fearless. To her critics, she was dangerous. And to the people she wrote about, she was a symbol of everything they fought against. But tonight wasn't about writing another story. Tonight, she was here because of a promise, a last-ditch effort to honor a deal she'd made with her editor. She had no choice but to spend 1 month embedded in the very community she had spent years vilifying. Perspective, her editor had called it, though Emily had rolled her eyes at the notion. She didn't need their perspective. She knew what they were like, what they stood for, or at least she thought she did. Inside the center, a different world awaited her. Voices echoed against the walls, lively and warm, despite the worn-out chairs and peeling paint. Laughter mixed with music, and children darted between adults carrying trays of food. It was chaotic, yes, but there was something undeniably human about it. Still, Emily tightened her grip on her notebook, already preparing herself for the confrontation she was certain would come. The first person to greet her wasn't at all what she had imagined. Marcus, a community organizer with a firm handshake and a disarming smile, welcomed her like an old friend. "You must be Emily," he said, his voice calm but knowing. He didn't have to say it out loud. He knew exactly who she was, what she had written, and why she was here. And yet, there wasn't an ounce of hostility in his demeanor. Instead, he seemed almost curious. As the evening wore on, Emily found herself drawn into conversations she hadn't expected. There was Fatima, a mother of 3 who had fled her war-torn country only to face new battles in her adopted homeland. There was Louis, a former gang member turned youth mentor, whose story of redemption seemed almost too extraordinary to be true. And then there was the elderly Miss Johnson, a retired schoolteacher who spoke with a kind of wisdom that only comes from a lifetime of struggle and triumph. Each of them had a story, a depth that couldn't be captured in the stereotypes Emily had once leaned on so heavily in her work. But this wasn't some magical moment of epiphany, at least not yet. Emily still carried her doubts, her defenses, and her deeply ingrained beliefs. The questions swirled in her mind, sharper than ever. Were these people the exception? Was this just a carefully curated show meant to sway her? Or had she been wrong all along? As the night wound down, Marcus approached her again, his expression serious but kind. "You've got a lot to learn," he said, almost as if he could see the storm of conflict brewing inside her. "But you're in the right place to start." He handed her a flyer for an upcoming community event and gave her a look that seemed to challenge her in ways she wasn't ready to face. Emily left the center that night with more questions than answers. For the first time in years, she felt a crack in the armor of certainty she had built around herself. What was it about these people, the very people she had once feared and vilified, that made them so resilient, so human? And why was it getting harder and harder to dismiss them as the caricatures she had once believed them to be? Little did she know, this was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Emily's journey would take her places she never thought she'd go, not just physically, but emotionally and morally. She would be tested, challenged, and ultimately changed in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And it all started on that rainy night, with a reluctant journalist walking into a room full of strangers she thought she knew. underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, Emily sat at her desk, staring blankly at the flyer Marcus had handed her the night before. The event was a block party, a community celebration meant to bring people together. Together, she thought bitterly. That word felt hollow to her, like one of those feel-good slogans that never meant much in the real world. Emily had spent her career dissecting words like that, peeling back the layers to expose what she called the hard realities of human nature. Her coffee sat untouched, going cold as she replayed moments from the night before. The look in Marcus's eyes, the way Fatima's voice softened when she talked about her children, the laughter echoing from the kids who didn't seem to notice the worn-down space around them. It all stuck with her in a way she didn't like. She had gone there expecting to confirm her beliefs, to find proof of the dysfunction she'd so often written about. But instead, she found cracks in her assumptions, small, almost imperceptible, but they were there. She opened her laptop and began typing furiously, as if putting her thoughts into words would help her make sense of them. Her fingers hesitated over the keys. For the first time, she wasn't sure how to frame her narrative. The Emily of yesterday would have started with a cutting remark about wasted taxpayer dollars or the futility of outreach programs. But now she wasn't so sure. She hated how much that unsettled her. The block party was in 3 days, and Emily debated whether to even go. She could find a way out, claim she had seen enough for her story. After all, she wasn't under any real obligation to immerse herself completely, was she? But deep down, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not yet. There was something about Marcus's parting words, about the quiet confidence in his tone, that felt like a challenge she wasn't ready to back down from. Over the next few days, Emily started doing what she did best, researching. She scoured online forums and old news reports about the neighborhood, trying to uncover the kinds of stories that would reinforce her point of view. It didn't take long to find headlines about gang violence, poverty, and unemployment. These were the stories she was used to seeing, the stories she had built her career on. And yet, there was an uneasy feeling in her chest as she clicked through each article. It felt too easy, too one-sided, like she was only looking at the shadows or ignoring the light. One story in particular caught her attention. It was about a young man named Jamal, a local athlete who had once been on track for a college scholarship. But a series of bad choices and an encounter with law enforcement that spiraled out of control had derailed his future. Emily recognized his name from the conversations she overheard at the community center. Luis had mentioned him briefly, referring to Jamal as one of the kids he was trying to mentor. Emily scribbled the name in her notebook. She wasn't sure why, but she felt compelled to learn more. She needed to understand what had gone wrong for someone like Jamal, and whether it was the community's fault or his own. The block party arrived quicker than Emily expected, and she found herself standing awkwardly at the edge of the gathering. The air smelled of grilled meat and spices, and the sound of music mixed with the hum of laughter and conversation. People moved around her, greeting one another warmly, as if the problems of the outside world didn't exist here. Emily felt out of place, a stranger in a space that was bursting with life. Marcus spotted her almost immediately and waved her over. "You came," he said, his voice carrying both surprise and approval. "Of course," Emily replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "I said I would." He smiled knowingly. "Well, let's get you introduced to some folks. There's a lot more to this place than you'll find in your research." Before she could respond, Marcus was leading her through the crowd, introducing her to people who greeted her with warm smiles and firm handshakes. She met business owners, teachers, and parents, each with their own stories, their own struggles and triumphs. And then she met Jamal. He was sitting on the steps of a nearby house, watching the festivities with a distant look in his eyes. Louis was sitting next to him, speaking quietly but intensely. Emily hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt, but Marcus waved her forward. "Jamal, this is Emily. She's doing a story on the neighborhood," Marcus said, his tone casual but purposeful. Jamal looked up at her, his expression guarded. He was younger than Emily had expected, with a mix of defiance and wariness in his eyes. "A story, huh?" he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "What's there to write about? Another headline about how messed up we are." The words stung, though Emily couldn't blame him for saying them. "Not exactly," she said carefully. "I'm trying to understand, that's all." Jamal let out a bitter laugh. "Understand what? How we got here? Or why we stay?" Louis put a hand on Jamal's shoulder, a silent gesture of encouragement. "She's here to listen, man. Give her a chance." Emily sat down on the steps, feeling the weight of the moment. For the first time in her career, she didn't have the luxury of keeping her distance. She wasn't just observing from the sidelines. She was in the middle of it, face to face with the people behind the stories she had written. Jamal's story came out slowly, in pieces, like a puzzle she had to assemble. He talked about his dreams of leaving the neighborhood, of making something of himself. He talked about the night it all fell apart, when a misunderstanding turned into a confrontation and his future vanished in an instant. But what struck Emily the most was the way he spoke about the people who had helped him pick up the pieces, Louis, Marcus, and others in the community who refused to give up on him. As Jamal spoke, Emily found herself listening in a way she hadn't before, not just for details to fill her notebook, but for the humanity in his words. He wasn't just a statistic or a headline. He was a person full of complexity and contradictions. The party continued around them, but Emily hardly noticed. For the first time, she felt the weight of what she had been missing all these years. The stories she had written before had been easy, too easy. They had been about people like Jamal, but they had never truly been for them. By the time the night ended, Emily felt a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. She had come here expecting to find confirmation of her beliefs, but instead she'd have found cracks in her armor. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to patch them up or let them break completely. As she walked back to her car, Marcus caught up with her. "So, what did you think?" he asked. Emily hesitated, her thoughts tangled. I have a lot to learn." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a good start." And as Emily drove away, the voices and faces of the people she had met stayed with her. She knew this story was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. Emily's mind raced as she drove home that night, the words and stories she had heard replaying in fragments. Jamal's defiant tone, Louis's calm reassurance, and even the unspoken tension in some of the smiles she'd received all seemed to linger in the air around her. She didn't know why she felt so unsettled. She was just here to write a story. That's what she kept telling herself, but it felt like something more was pulling at her, something she couldn't yet name. For the next few days, she tried to process everything, burying herself in her notes and recordings. She replayed her conversation with Jamal, dissecting his words, looking for an angle that felt familiar, safe. But there was none. Jamal's story wasn't one she could simplify into neat categories. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance, nor was he entirely free from blame for the decisions he'd made. Yet the way the community had rallied around him, refusing to let him spiral further, challenged everything she thought she knew about people like him. To make matters worse, Emily's editor, Karen, was growing impatient. "You've been out there for weeks now," Karen said during their latest phone call. "Where's the story? Your readers are expecting something bold, something provocative. Don't get soft on me, Emily." "I'm not getting soft," Emily shot back, though even she didn't believe her own words. "I'm just trying to get it right." "Just remember what you're good at," Karen replied, her voice sharp. "Don't lose your edge." Her editor's words stayed with her long after the call ended. Emily knew what Karen wanted, a scathing piece that would provoke outrage and drive clicks. But every time she tried to write it, she felt a nagging sense of unease. For the first time in her career, Emily wasn't sure she could deliver what was expected of her. Determined to break through the mental block, she decided to spend more time in the neighborhood. She needed to dig deeper, to understand not just the people but the systems that shaped their lives. What was it about this place that seemed both broken and alive at the same time? Why did some people, like Jamal, falter while others, like Marcus or Lewis, managed to rise above? Emily began shadowing Marcus during his daily rounds, which took them from local schools to food pantries to small businesses struggling to stay afloat. Everywhere they went, Marcus was greeted warmly, but Emily couldn't help but notice the wariness in his eyes, the weight he seemed to carry. He was a man who had dedicated his life to his community, but even he wasn't immune to the pressures around him. One afternoon, as they walked back from a meeting with local youth leaders, Emily finally asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "Why do you do this, Marcus? Why do you stay here when you could probably go somewhere easier?" Marcus stopped walking and looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Because this is my home," he said simply. "It's not perfect, but it's worth fighting for. These people, they're my family, even if we're not related, and if I don't stand up for them, who will?" His words struck a chord in Emily, though she wasn't sure why. She had always prided herself on being an outsider, someone who could observe without getting too close. But Marcus's commitment to his community made her question her own detachment. Was it really strength, or was it a way to avoid confronting her own biases and fears? As the days went on, Emily started noticing things she hadn't before: the way neighbors looked out for each other, the quiet acts of kindness that went unnoticed by the outside world. She also began to see the cracks, the frustrations and tensions that simmered beneath the surface. There were arguments over resources, distrust of authorities, and moments of despair that even Marcus couldn't always soothe. It was a complicated, messy reality, far removed from the black and white narratives she was used to writing. One evening, Emily found herself back at the community center, where a heated debate was unfolding. A new housing development was being proposed in the neighborhood, promising economic growth but also threatening to displace long-time residents. The room buzzed with anger and fear as people voiced their concerns, some accusing the developers of exploitation, others arguing that the project might bring much-needed jobs. Emily sat quietly, her notebook in hand, as the arguments grew louder. It was Louis who finally stepped in, his calm voice cutting through the chaos. "We can't just fight each other," he said. "That's what they want. We need to figure out how to make this work for us, not against us." His words seemed to resonate, and the room gradually settled down. But the tension was still palpable, and Emily could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a debate about housing. It was a battle for the soul of the community, a fight to hold on to something that was slipping away. After the meeting, Emily approached Louis, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. "Do you really think they can make this work?" she asked. Louis shrugged, a small, tired smile on his face. "I don't know, but I know we can't give up. That's what they're counting on, that we'll get tired, that we'll stop trying. But we won't. Not this time." His words stayed with her as she walked back to her car. For the first time, Emily began to see the community not just as a subject for her story, but as something more, a place filled with real people, each with their own struggles and dreams. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive, vibrant in a way she hadn't expected. But the more Emily saw, the more conflicted she became. Her growing empathy for the people she was writing about clashed with the cynicism she had built her career on. She couldn't deny the systemic issues that plagued the neighborhood, but she also couldn't ignore the resilience and humanity she had witnessed. The question that haunted her now wasn't just what story to tell, but how to tell it, and whether she had the courage to tell the truth, even if it cost her everything she had built. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, staring at her blank computer screen, a memory from her childhood came rushing back. She was 9 years old, sitting in the back seat of her family's car as they drove through a neighborhood, much like the one she was now reporting on. Her mother had locked the doors, her father had muttered something about those people, and Emily had watched through the window, wide-eyed and curious. She hadn't understood it then, but that moment had planted a seed, shaping the way she saw the world. Now, years later, Emily found herself questioning everything she had been taught. The people she had once feared, the ones she had written about so confidently, were no longer faceless figures in the distance. They were Marcus, Louis, Jamal, Fatima, and so many others whose stories she could no longer ignore. And for the first time, Emily wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong all along. But as she admitted that, what would it cost her? Emily's sleepless nights became more frequent as the days wore on. She spent hours staring at her laptop, her notes scattered around her like fragments of a puzzle she couldn't piece together. Her deadline was fast approaching, and Karen's messages were becoming more demanding, each one a thinly veiled reminder of what was expected from her. But Emily wasn't the same person she had been when she first set foot in that community center. The story she was writing wasn't the one Karen wanted, and the weight of that conflict was beginning to suffocate her. The housing development controversy was escalating. Protests had started forming outside City Hall, drawing attention from both local media and the wider public. Emily stood in the crowd one afternoon, her recorder in hand as chants filled the air. The protesters were a mix of familiar faces and new ones, residents who were terrified of losing their homes, activists from other neighborhoods who had come to show solidarity, and even children holding handmade signs that read, "Save our homes." The energy was electric, charged with a mix of hope and desperation. Marcus was at the forefront, his voice carrying over the noise as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about buildings," he shouted. "This is about people, families, history, community. They want to erase us, but we won't let them." The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers reverberating through the streets. Emily couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about Marcus in that moment, his passion radiating in a way that made her chest tighten. For the first time, she found herself swept up in the emotion of it all, forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to be an observer. But not everyone in the crowd shared the same vision. As Emily moved through the throng, she overheard snippets of conversations, whispers of doubt, frustration, and even anger. Some residents were tired of fighting, convinced that resistance was futile. Others saw the protests as a waste of time, arguing that the development could bring jobs and opportunities they desperately needed. The divisions within the community were becoming more pronounced, and Emily could feel the tension mounting with every passing day. She decided to follow up with Jamal, curious to hear his perspective. She found him on the basketball court where they had first met, shooting hoops alone as the sun dipped below the horizon. He didn't seem surprised to see her, though his expression was guarded as usual. "So, what's your take on all this?" she asked, leaning against the chain-link fence. Jamal dribbled the ball absently, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I get why people are mad, but I don't know if it matters. They're gonna do what they want to do, no matter what we say." "Do you really believe that?" Emily pressed, sensing the conflict in his voice. Jamal shrugged, his movements heavy with frustration. "I've seen this before. They come in, make their promises, then they tear everything down and leave us with nothing. It's hard to believe it'll be different this time." His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the cynicism that had taken root in so many people here. Emily could feel her throat tighten as she thought about the stories she had heard, the lives that had been uprooted by decisions made in boardrooms miles away. And yet, even in his frustration, there was a flicker of something in Jamal's eyes, a tiny ember of hope that refused to be extinguished. Emily decided to stay late that night, sitting in her car with the windows rolled down as the neighborhood quieted. The community felt different in the stillness, its vibrant energy replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on her. She thought about Marcus's words, Louise's resilience, Jamal's doubt, and Fatima's quiet strength. They were all fighting battles she had never truly understood, battles she had once dismissed with the stroke of her pen. And now she was starting to realize that their fight wasn't just theirs, it was hers too. The next morning, Emily arrived at the community center to find chaos. The front windows had been smashed, graffiti scrawled across the walls in bold, angry letters. "Stay out." A small crowd had gathered outside, their faces a mix of shock and anger. Marcus was inside, helping to clean up the mess, his jaw clenched tight as he swept up shards of glass. "Who did this?" Emily asked, her voice low. Marcus didn't look up. Could have been anyone. Developers trying to scare us off. Maybe someone in the neighborhood who's sick of the fight. Doesn't matter. We're not going anywhere. Emily could feel the tension in his voice, the strain of carrying the weight of his community on his shoulders. She wanted to say something, anything, to ease the burden, but no words came. Instead, she grabbed a broom and started helping, her movements slow and deliberate. As the day went on, more people showed up to help repair the damage. The graffiti was scrubbed away, the windows boarded up, and the sense of solidarity that had brought them together in the first place began to resurface. But the underlying tension remained, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Later that evening, Emily found herself sitting with Fatima, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the cleanup. They sat on the steps outside the center, the air thick with unspoken worries. "They're trying to scare us," Fatima said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what scares me more is what happens if we lose. If they take this place, where will we go? What will happen to my children?" Emily didn't have an answer. All she could do was listen, her notebook forgotten in her lap as Fatima poured out her fears. It was in that moment that Emily realized the true stakes of this story. It wasn't just about a housing development or a journalist's search for truth. It was about survival, about people fighting to hold on to the things that made them who they were. As the night deepened, Emily's resolve hardened. She didn't know how the story would end, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. The next morning, she woke to a text from Karen. "Your deadline is tomorrow. I need something, anything." Emily stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The pressure to deliver was suffocating, but for the first time, she wasn't worried about Karen or her readers. She was worried about getting it right. And as she sat down to write, she knew she was standing at a crossroads. The choice she made now would define not just her story, but herself. Emily sat staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop. The weight of Karen's deadline loomed over her, but it wasn't just the pressure of delivering that tightened her chest. It was the realization that no matter how she wrote this story, it would have consequences. She could already hear Karen's voice dissecting her draft. Too soft, too empathetic, not provocative enough. But what if her words stirred something even deeper, a backlash against the people she had come to know? What if she made things worse instead of better? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. "Emergency meeting tonight at the center. Come if you can." The urgency in his words sent a ripple of unease through her. Something had happened. By the time Emily arrived, the community center was packed. The usual energy, the hum of quiet determination, had been replaced by an undercurrent of panic. People were whispering in tight circles, their faces tense. Marcus stood at the front of the room, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" Emily asked as she squeezed her way to the front. Marcus glanced at her, his eyes wary but alert. "We got word this morning. They fast-tracked the development project. Construction crews are set to start next week." The room erupted in chaos. Voices overlapped, anger and despair filling the air. Liz tried to calm everyone down, but even his steady presence couldn't contain the outrage. "They can't do this," someone shouted. "We haven't even had a chance to fight back. They don't care about us." Another voice replied, laced with bitterness. "They just want us out of the way." Marcus raised his hands, his voice cutting through the noise. "Listen, I know this is bad, but we can't let them push us out without a fight. We've come too far to give up now." Emily watched as the crowd slowly quieted, but the tension didn't dissipate. The stakes had just been raised, and the fight that had already felt impossible was now on the brink of collapse. Her mind raced as she tried to process what this meant, not just for the community, but for her story. The escalation wasn't just a plot point, it was a turning point, and she was caught in the middle of it. As the meeting went on, Emily noticed Jamal standing in the corner, his arms folded tightly across his chest. He hadn't said a word, but his presence felt heavier than usual. She waited until the crowd began to disperse before approaching him. "You okay?" she asked cautiously. Jamal hesitated, his jaw working as if he were trying to decide whether to speak. Finally, he said, "I heard something earlier. Don't know if it's true, but some people are saying the developers are paying folks off, offering them money to stop protesting, to move out quietly." Emily's stomach dropped. "Do you think it's happening here?" Jamal shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Wouldn't surprise me. People are scared. Money talks." The possibility hit Emily like a punch to the gut. If it was true, it could tear the community apart. The unity they had fought so hard to build could crumble under the weight of desperation and betrayal. She needed to find out more, but the thought of digging into it made her uneasy. If she uncovered evidence of bribery, what then? Would exposing it help the community, or would it just deepen the fractures? As she left the center that night, the city felt darker than usual, the air heavier. Her mind was a storm of unanswered questions, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. She decided to follow her instincts, starting with a call to one of her contacts at City Hall. After several rings, the voice on the other end answered, low and cautious. "I need to know if there's been any unusual activity tied to this development project," Emily said, keeping her voice steady. "Bribes, payoffs, anything like that?" There was a long pause before the contact replied. "I can't say much, but you didn't hear this from me. There's been a lot of cash changing hands lately. Developers are desperate to avoid delays. They'll do whatever it takes to keep things moving." Emily's breath caught. The confirmation was both validating and terrifying. This wasn't just about a housing project. It was a web of corruption that extended far beyond what she had imagined. And now she had a decision to make. She could include this revelation in her story, knowing it would send shockwaves through the community and beyond, or she could keep digging, risking her safety to uncover the full truth. The following day, she met with Marcus to share what she had learned. His reaction was a mix of anger and determination. "We need to get ahead of this," he said. "If people find out on their own, it'll destroy us. But if we're the ones to expose it, maybe we can turn it into a weapon." Emily nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought. This wasn't the kind of journalism she was used to, messy, personal, and fraught with consequences. But she knew Marcus was right. The truth was their only weapon, and it was her job to wield it. As they talked, Emily noticed a shadow pass by the window. She turned quickly, but whoever it was had already disappeared. A chill ran down her spine. The tension in the community was palpable, and now that she was digging deeper, she couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching her. That night, Emily's phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "Be careful who you trust. Not everyone is on your side." Her heart raced as she stared at the screen. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. And for the first time, she realized just how dangerous this story had become. Emily didn't sleep that night. The anonymous message weighed heavily on her mind, each word feeling like a shadow creeping closer. She replayed her conversations with Marcus, Jamal, and the others in her head, wondering if she'd missed something, if someone close to the fight was hiding a secret. The trust she'd been building with the community now felt fragile, as though it'd shatter at any moment. Yet she knew she couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake, not just for the people she'd come to care about, but for herself. This story had become more than just a career milestone. It had become her reckoning. The next day, Emily met Marcus in a quiet cafe away from the neighborhood. She showed him the message on her phone, her voice low as she said, "I don't know who sent this, but it feels like someone's trying to scare me off, or maybe warn me." Marcus leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he studied the text. "Who have you talked to outside the neighborhood?" Anyone tied to the developers? Emily hesitated, thinking about her contact at City Hall. Just one person, and I was careful. They didn't tell me much, only that bribes are happening. Marcus nodded slowly. It's possible someone found out. But if they're watching you, they're watching all of us. We need to be smart about this. Emily's chest tightened. The stakes were higher than she'd realized. She thought about leaving, pulling back, and handing the story off to someone else. But when she looked at Marcus, the determination in his eyes reminded her why she couldn't walk away. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a fight for people's lives, their homes, and their dignity. That evening, Marcus called for an emergency meeting with the community's core organizers. Emily sat in the back, watching as Marcus outlined a bold plan. They would hold a public rally at City Hall, not just to protest, but to expose the bribes and corruption. It was a high-risk move, one that could bring the community closer together or tear it apart. The room was tense as Marcus finished speaking, the weight of the decision pressing down on everyone. "We can't win by staying quiet," Marcus said firmly. "This is our chance to make them listen, but we have to stand together." The group agreed, albeit reluctantly. Emily stayed late, talking to Luis and Fatima as they worked on signs for the rally. Fatima was quiet, her usual optimism replaced by a nervous energy. Finally, she said, "Do you think it'll work? Do you think they'll listen?" Emily didn't know how to answer. She wanted to say yes, but the truth was far murkier. All she could do was hope that the rally would shine a light on the truth without devastating the very people it was meant to protect. The day of the rally arrived, and the energy outside City Hall was electric. Hundreds of people showed up, their voices rising in unison as they chanted and waved signs. The media was there too, cameras flashing as reporters jotted down notes. Emily stood near the front, her notebook in hand, trying to capture every detail while her heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment everything had been building toward, and she could feel the tension crackling in the air. Marcus took the microphone, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the crowd. He spoke about the bribes, the backdoor deals, and the lengths the developers had gone to silence the community. "They think they can buy us off, scare us into giving up," he said, his voice rising. "But we're still here, we're still fighting." The crowd erupted in cheers, but as Marcus continued, Emily noticed movement at the edges of the rally. A group of men in suits lingered near the steps of City Hall, their expressions cold and calculating. She recognized one of them from a photo she'd seen during her research, a senior executive from the development company. Her pulse quickened as she realized what was happening. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. As the rally reached its peak, a voice cut through the noise. "This is all lies." The crowd turned as a man stepped forward, his face familiar to Emily. It was one of the residents, someone she'd interviewed weeks ago. He looked nervous, his hands shaking as he pointed at Marcus. "They're just trying to stir up trouble. The developers are offering us a way out, and we should take it." The crowd murmured in confusion, the energy shifting as people began questioning what they were hearing. Marcus tried to regain control, but the man's words had planted a seed of doubt. Emily's mind raced. Was this man working with the developers? Had he been paid off? Before she could act, another voice rose from the crowd, Jamal's. "That's enough," he shouted, stepping forward to stand beside Marcus. "Don't listen to him. We all know what's really going on here." The tension was unbearable as the two men faced off. Jamal's voice was steady, but Emily could see the strain in his expression. He was putting himself on the line, and it was a gamble that could either rally the crowd or break them apart completely. Then, the twist Emily hadn't anticipated happened. A young boy stepped forward, one of the children who had been helping with the protests. He held up a phone, the screen displaying a video. "I have proof," he shouted. The video played on a makeshift screen, showing the same man who had just spoken against Marcus. He was sitting in a dimly lit room, a developer's representative handing him an envelope. The crowd gasped as the man in the video muttered something about keeping people in line. The reaction was immediate. The crowd surged with renewed energy, their chants louder than ever. The man who had tried to discredit Marcus slipped away, his face pale. Emily's hands shook as she jotted down notes. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The truth lay bare in front of everyone. But as the rally ended and the crowd began to disperse, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. She caught up with Marcus, who was surrounded by supporters but looked uneasy. "What's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated before saying, "That video, I didn't know about it. Someone sent it to the kid this morning." Emily frowned. "Who? Why?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know. But whoever it was, they wanted this to happen. They wanted the truth out, but they didn't want their name attached to it." As Emily walked away, her mind churned with questions. The story had reached its climax, but the final twist left her wondering if she'd seen the whole picture. Who had pulled the strings behind the scenes? And what was their endgame? For now, the community had won a battle, but Emily couldn't help but feel that the war was far from over. As the crowd dispersed, leaving the steps of City Hall quieter than they'd been all day, Emily lingered. Her notebook was full, but her mind was restless, replaying the events that had unfolded. The rally had been a victory, a moment of truth that brought the community together in a way she hadn't seen before. Yet, there was an unease she couldn't shake, a lingering question about the mysterious video and the person behind it. Whoever had sent it had done so with purpose, but their silence left a void Emily wasn't sure how to fill. Marcus found her sitting on a low wall nearby, staring out at the empty streets. He looked exhausted, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We did it," he said, sitting down beside her. "At least for now." "You think the developers will back off?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "For a while, maybe," Marcus replied. "But they'll regroup. They always do. This fight isn't over. It probably never will be. But today we reminded them that we're not invisible. That counts for something." Emily nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The rally had been a turning point, but it wasn't a clean resolution. The developers might slow their plans, and the brides might stop for now, but the underlying issues, the inequality, the disregard for the community's voice, weren't going away anytime soon. Still, for the people who had stood together today, this victory mattered. It was a step forward, a crack in the facade of power that had seemed impenetrable. Over the next few weeks, Emily worked tirelessly to finish her article. She spent hours poring over her notes, rewatching the video, and interviewing members of the community to capture their perspectives. The piece wasn't just about the rally or the corruption. It was about the resilience of people who refused to be erased. She wanted to make sure their voices were at the center, not just the conflict. When the article was published, it spread faster than she'd anticipated. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded with shares and comments, and even some local politicians began calling for investigations into the developers' practices. For the first time in her career, Emily felt like her work was making a tangible difference, and it wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing. It was about amplifying the voices of those who had been ignored for too long. But with the spotlight came scrutiny. Anonymous emails flooded her inbox, some supportive, others threatening. One, in particular, stood out. It was short, just a single sentence. "You're getting too close to something you don't understand." It sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to let it scare her away. If anything, it only strengthened her resolve. Emily returned to the neighborhood a week later, wanting to see how people were feeling after everything that had happened. The atmosphere was different, not carefree, but lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. She found Louis painting a mural on the side of the community center, a vibrant depiction of the rally with faces of the residents woven into the design. "This is incredible," she said, watching him add the final strokes. Louis smiled, stepping back to admire his work. "It's our story," he said. "No matter what happens next, they can't take this from us." Emily felt a lump in her throat. That was the heart of it. The story wasn't just hers to tell. It belonged to the people who had lived it, who had fought for it, and who would keep fighting long after the headlines faded. As she walked through the streets, she stopped by Fatima's bakery, where the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Fatima greeted her with a warm smile and a plate of pastries, insisting she take some home. "You brought us hope, Emily," she said. "That's something we'll never forget." The gratitude was humbling, but Emily knew she hadn't done it alone. She'd only shined a light on what was already there: the strength, the courage, the determination of people who refused to be silenced. One lingering question still gnawed at her, though: who had sent the video that turned the tide at the rally? She hadn't stopped trying to find out, but every lead had hit a dead end. It wasn't until weeks later, when she received an unmarked envelope at her office, that she got an answer. Inside was a single photograph of a man she didn't recognize, standing with one of the developers. On the back, a note read, "Sometimes the truth needs a little push." The cryptic message only deepened the mystery, but Emily decided to let it rest. She'd done her part, and the story had taken on a life of its own. Chasing shadows wouldn't change what mattered most. The community had won a battle, and their fight had inspired others to stand up against injustice in their own neighborhoods. Months passed, and the development project was put on indefinite hold. Investigations into the corruption uncovered more layers of wrongdoing, leading to the resignation of several officials. The neighborhood still faced challenges, but there was a newfound sense of pride and solidarity that couldn't be undone. Emily visited less frequently, knowing it was time for her to move on to other stories. But every time she did return, she was greeted with open arms. The bakery, the mural, the laughter of kids playing in the streets, they were reminders of what resilience looked like, of the power of people standing together. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, reviewing her notes for her next assignment, she found herself thinking about the person she'd been before all of this. The journalist chasing provocative stories without understanding the lies behind them. The woman who had let fear and bias dictate her perspective. That version of herself felt distant now, like a shadow she'd finally stepped out of. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it hadn't come without mistakes, but it had been worth it. For the first time, Emily felt like her work wasn't just about her ambition, it was about something bigger. It was about truth, justice, and the humanity that connects us all, even when the world tries to tear us apart. As she turned off her laptop and looked out at the city lights, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but that was okay. Change didn't come all at once. It came in moments, in stories, in the voices of people who refused to give up. And Emily was ready to keep telling those stories, one truth at a time.